en China. Nuestro ilustre conferencista, el profesor Carmela Mesa Lago, es profesor distinguido y emérito de Economía y Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Pittsburgh y ha sido profesor visitante e investigador en 7 países. Es autor de 94 libros y 318 artículos y capítulos en 9 lenguas y 34 países. Está especializado en temas de seguridad social y sistemas económicos comparativos, así como en sistemas de pensiones en América Latina y el Caribe. Entonces, esta sesión, bueno, pues es para que la aprovechemos de cabo a rabo. Le damos la bienvenida al profesor Mesa Lago, con quien ya me puse de acuerdo sobre la cuestión técnica. Así que, sin más, le voy a dar la palabra al profesor Mesa Lago para iniciar su exposición. Bienvenido, maestro.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, no sé la hora en que están los participantes, pero buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches. Este es el tema que voy a presentar. Está basado en un libro que llevo trabajando un año y medio. Y es las lecciones para China de la privatización de pensiones, 40 años de privatización de pensiones en América Latina. Ok. Entonces, el objetivo de esta presentación como ven en la lámina es evaluar. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I am speaking in Spanish. So the objective of this presentation is first to evaluate the performance of 10 pension systems with individual accounts in Latin America in the period from 1980 to 2020. And I do this based on 5 key International Labor Organization Social Security principles, which are there: coverage of the labor force and the elderly population, social solidarity and gender equity, benefit sufficiency, efficient administration, and reasonable managerial costs. I will spend some time discussing whether there is competition or not. And the 5th is financial and actuarial sustainability. And the second is China's dual pension system. And the lessons for China from this Latin American experience of 40 years and based in the 5 ILO principles. I also very briefly will discuss some important questions on priorities for China's future pension policy. So in Latin America, between 1980 and 2008, 11 countries shifted totally or partially from what I would call public systems, characterized by defined benefit, pay-as-you-go, financing, and public administration, and private systems, which are typified by defined contribution, fully funded individual accounts, and private administration, profit-seeking corporations. So the table that you have here ranks the countries according to the year of implementation of the structural reform. So the first, the pioneer Chile, began in 1981, and the last one, Panama, in 2008. And we're talking about 14 years in which there has not been another structural pension reform in the region. And these structural reforms were not alike in all 11 Latin American countries. There were 3 models that I have identified in my works. As you can see, the majority is substitutive. And this means that the previous public pension is shut down and all the insured are transferred to the new private system with the characteristics that I have summarized before. Then your system is converted into a pillar, a first pillar public. A second pillar private is added, and the insurer at the time of retirement collect pensions from both pillars or tiers. And then, and this is unique of Latin America, I don't know any other country in the world that have this parallel systems in Colombia and Peru. And the public system continues in most cases, in one case at least, there is a parametric reform to strengthen this public system. Then a private system is added and the two compete among them. Now, there have been a series of flaws of private pension systems that I am going to analyze later. And because of these flaws, reforms have been implemented in most of these countries. As you can see, the only substitutive system that remains is that of the Dominican Republic. The rest have changed. Now we have not 4, but 7 mixed systems. The 2 parallel systems continue, but they are now discussing a reform. Most of the drafts for reform are moving from the previous substitute to mixed. And finally, in the case of Argentina, is the only country that moved from private to public completely. And then China, as a majority of countries in Latin America, also have a mixed system that combines basic social insurance and individual accounts, but with significant differences between the 2 major schemes. That's why I say it's a dual system. So let me very briefly explain what are the features of these 2 systems. First one, the most important, is the urban employees, wage earner or salaried workers. And it's mandatory, obligatory, and have 5 pillars. Although I must say that trying to clarify this was extremely difficult because Chinese refer to the first 2 pillars as one, which is unique. I mean, in all over the world, they are separated. So I am going to use the traditional approach. And so the first one is a basic social insurance pension, like public systems in Latin America. Then you have the individual accounts. Then you have occupational plans in most in large corporations. And finally, and this is very recent, is the introduction of voluntary commercial insurance savings individual accounts. This is very small so far as I can assert. We're talking about 3.5% of the labor force, but it's expanding. Now, how is this financed? There are contributions, as in Latin America, they are as a percentage of wages or salaries to basic social insurance. And employers contribute to the basic system, but the employees' contributions go to the individual account. Now, the second system in China is urban and rural. Those are non-salaried workers, residents. This is very important. So in the first case, it was mandatory. Usually it was formal employees, and here are residents. And this is it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. I have only 2 pillars instead of 4. The basic social insurance and individual accounts. One problem is that there are no occupational plans. There is no commercial private insurance. And the group lacks resources. They cannot afford to join, even if they were voluntary, occupational pension plans, and particularly this new commercial insurance. Finance is different. There are flat contributions from the central government to basic social insurance. And the residents also have flat contributions to the individual accounts. There are no employers' contribution because these people don't have an employer. They, as I said before, and there are also local government subsidies to the system, not only from the central government, but also from local municipalities, etc. And this makes tremendous differences because it changes from one municipality to another. Usually the wealthiest one have substantial local subsidies, but the very poor ones either don't have any or they are very small. There are very significant differences in these dual systems because in the resident program, they have lower coverage. Some groups are largely excluded. There are lesser contributions and therefore a smaller accumulation in the individual account, and those lower pensions than in the urban employee schemes. So I will say that the urban employee system is very similar to the systems in Latin American countries. You don't have that type of resident program in Latin America, except that for some groups, very small, very low number of countries, for agricultural workers and similar groups. So the comparisons with Latin America are difficult. First of all, China's population is more than twice the entire population of Latin America. It's the second world economy. In addition, some Chinese cities and urban areas exceed the standards of the most developed Latin American countries widely, whereas some Chinese rural areas are similar to Latin America less developed countries. In terms of the inception of the pension system, some Latin American countries were pioneers in Social Security pensions, for instance, Uruguay and Chile, whereas China's modern Social Security appeared later than in most other Latin American countries. In spite of these differences, I think there are valuable experience from Latin America that could be useful to China. So now I am going to make the evaluation of the pension privatization in Latin America in 40 years from 1980 to 2020. And I will contrast the promises of the structural reformers, the privatizers, with the available statistics from Latin America. Most of them are from an association, an international association of private pension funds supervisors. So this data, that is the bulk of the material that I use to contrast with the promises, are actually standardized statistics developed by this international association of these private pension funds. So we start with coverage, and the promise was that the contributive coverage of the labor force will increase. That means the contributive pensions. But there were no mention at all about non-contributive pensions, because at the time that these promises were made, and we are talking about very early in the 1980s and later by the World Bank, the assumption was that coverage of the contributory pension will expand. That didn't happen in practice, as we are going to see. And then the World Bank and other regional and international organizations began to push for this non-contributory pensions or social pensions, as they are labeled in most of Latin America. And so they didn't refer to it. What about the results? First of all, coverage of the labor force decreased in all countries after the reform. I have compared this, and the average went down from 38% before privatization to 26% in 2004. All countries by the time have already privatized the system, except for Panama. And later on, coverage grew. But in the 5 less developed countries, like El Salvador, Dominican Republic, and others, it only covers from 21 to 30. %. The convention minimum standard for Social Security set that coverage at 50% of the labor force, and therefore, in these less developed countries in Latin America, they are way below the minimum standards of the ILO. Furthermore, it's very difficult to expand coverage in these countries because the informal sector usually is the majority of the labor force. There are countries in which informal workers are 70% of the labor force. And because informal workers don't have an employer, they don't have the employer contribution. The employer cannot make the deduction from the salary. And it's extremely difficult to detect them, enroll them, collect the contributions, and then pay the pensions. And then in terms of the coverage of the elderly population, contrary to the contributory coverage, it grew in all countries. Actually, it expanded much more than the contributory pensions. And why was that? It was due to the non-contributory pensions that were not mentioned in the promises. But these non-contributory pensions are not part of the private system. They are exogenous to the private system. They are provided by the state, and they are financed by the state. And this is quite interesting because one of the principles of the privatizers was that the state would play a subsidiary role, a secondary role, the market. Only when the market was not able to solve the problem, then the state will have to intervene. Well, what I am going to show through this presentation is just the opposite, that the role of the state has been fundamental. Without the state, the private system could not exist. So the second principle is social solidarity and gender equity. And there were no promises here. Why? Because the individual accounts, theoretically at least, are owned by the insurer. And so they won't share the individual account with anybody else. Hence, there are not transfers among generations typical of a public system in which the younger with their contribution help to finance the pensions of the elderly. There are no transfers among income groups from the wealthiest to the less richest, and neither there are transfers among genders, from men to women. So what happened? Because there were no promises. Well, actually, social solidarity was improved in most of the pension systems of Latin America, but they were due again, not to the private system, but to state policies such as non-contributory pensions that I have mentioned already, fiscal subsidies to low contributory pensions, and inclusion policies. So once again, a significant role of the state, not a subsidiary role. Concerning gender, there are discrimination against women, both resulting from the labor force, but from the private system itself. Concerning the labor force, women have a lower participation in the labor force than men. Second, their salary is always lower than that of men for the same task or type of work, even when it is in the law, because the law is not implemented in most countries of the world, and certainly not in Latin America. And third, women leave the labor force in order to raise their children, and in other cases take care of the sick and the elder. And therefore, during this period, they are not contributing to the Social Security pension system. And now there are demographic factors too. Women usually retire because of the legislation 5 years before men, but they have a life expectancy around 5 years more than men. Therefore, they have 10 years more than men. And here comes the private system. The private system estimates the pension based on what has been accumulated in the individual account, plus investment capital returns, and then they apply a mortality table. The mortality table projects how many years that retired person is going to live, but they have differentiated mortality tables for men and for women. So because of women, 10 years longer, the pension has to be stretched for a longer period of time. And in view of all the factors that I have explained before, the pension of women is certainly going to be lower than men. And this is confirmed by other statistics that we have. So the private systems accentuate gender inequalities in addition to those derived from the labor market, particularly because of this form of estimated the pension and the differentiated mortality tables by sex. You have to excuse me because the problem is that I cannot move this with the arrow, but I have to go, I think, slide by slide. Okay, so the third principle is benefit sufficiency or adequacy. And what was the promise? The promise was very clear. They say it will be adequate. Now, I want to use one phrase from the father of the private system in Chile, the Minister of Social Security under the dictatorship of Pinochet, José Piñera, is not only the father of the private system in Chile, but he played a very important role traveling all over Latin America and selling the Chilean model with the support of the World Bank, financial and technical. And he said it will be 10% of the last salary. He was referring to what is called the replacement rate. The replacement rate is a percentage that is applied to an average salary, which usually is called the basic salary or the reference salary. And this could be like the entire working life of the insured, or it could be 20 years, or at the best, 10 years. But he was not referring to this average that makes the pension lower, of course, because it's a longer period and at the beginning you have lower salary at the end, usually. It was referring to the last salary, to the last monthly salary, 70%. That was the promise. So what do we find in the statistics? First of all, the Inter-American Development Bank, with data from 2015, estimated these replacement rates as an average of the private system, 39.8%. But in the public system was much higher. It was 64.7%. Furthermore, the 39.8% average for the private system was below the minimum set by the ILO of 45%, whereas in the public system, it was above 45%. And the second is that when we go country by country, the replacement rate in 5 private systems, it was lower than the 45% in the majority, and the majority of the insured, they wouldn't get a pension. They won't comply with all the requirements to get a full pension, and they will only get the balance that was left in the individual account. So the statistics that we have available certainly reboot the promise of 70% of the salary. In the case of Chile, actually, a commission that worked under President Bachelet in 2015 estimated that the replacement rate was 35%. That's one half, not 30% of the last salary, 35% of an average salary. It was less than half what Piñera promised. Okay, the fourth principle is efficient administration and reasonable administrative costs. And here the promise was that the competition in the private system will reduce administrative costs. The idea was that there is going to be competition among the different private administrators. They usually are abbreviated as AFPs in Latin America. And the insured will select the best administrator, meaning the one that charge lower administrative costs, have higher capital returns, and therefore they have higher level of pensions. In practice, that didn't work. We are going to see several indicators that support this point. And the reason why people changed was because, one, publicity. In Mexico, for instance, 50% of all administrative expenses go for publicity, and also commissioners. This is where individuals that will change insure from administrator A to B, and will receive a commission from the administrator where the insurer was transferred. So this was not really the competition didn't function in most private systems. The first one is that the number of administrators have decreased significantly through time from 1999 to 2021, which are the statistics that we have standardized for all the countries. And there have been an increasing concentration of insured in the major 2 AFPs. Second is that the percentage of affiliates that annually change administrators have shrunk sharply. This is important. As more transfer you have, more competition there is, and the opposite is true. In 5 systems, actually, data from 2020 and 2021 is the last year, but we are looking at a long period of time, has been between 0 and 3%. So the transfers are very small. Excuse me, between 0 and 1%. And third is because there is no competition, the administrative costs have been high and sustained. They have not decreased as it was promised. So the discount for commissions charged by the administrators represent between 23% and 30% of the deposit. So let's say that from your salary, 10% is withdrawn by the employer, and theoretically everything should go to the individual account, but it happens that as much as 30% of that 10% goes to the administrator. Two famous economists in the United States, a Nobel Prize, Peter Diamond and Nicholas Barr from the London School of Economics, have estimated that by each 1 percentage point deducted for the commission, the future pension is reduced by 20%. That means that in Peru, because you have 30%, the pension will be reduced by 30%. And final, but very important, profit as a percentage of the net patrimony, profit that is earned by the administrators, oscillates from 20 to 48% in 4 systems, and from 12 to 60% in another 4. So there are countries where the administrative profit is half. In the public system, neither you have publicity, commissioners that change people, and of course you don't have profits. So this makes the system even more expensive. And finally, financial actuarial sustainability. And here is where you have a lot of promises. The first one is that the ownership of the individual account and the private administration will motivate the insured to pay their contributions. What we have from these statistics of the AIOS is just the opposite. The percentage of affiliates that contributed have drastically declined in 8 out of 10 systems. For instance, in the case of El Salvador, it declined by 42 percentage points. In the case of Mexico, by 32 percentage points. So it's just the opposite of the promise. The second promise was that the pension capital will increase significantly. And what we found is actually the only promise that have been fulfilled, but not completely, as we are going to see. This pension fund have grown notably in terms of the amount in the individual account converted to US dollars and as a percentage of GDP. However, data from Chile comparing 2019 and 2021 shows that the fund, the individual account in Chile declined by 21%. 21%. Chile is no longer the country with the highest accumulation of funds. Now it's Mexico. Used to be second, because of course Mexico have a much larger labor market. And I predicted that that will happen several years ago. So it's now in 2021, it's Mexico with the highest accumulation. And in the case of Peru, and also in the case of Chile, as a percentage of GDP between 2019 and 2021, there was a decline of 8 percentage points. And in Peru also, there was a decline of both the amount accumulated and the percentage of GDP. Therefore, it's quite interesting that the pioneer, the prediction or the promise didn't materialize. At least it did for a long time, but no longer. And the third promise was that the investment portfolio will diversify away from government debt because there is a significant concentration, as we are going to see, in government debt. And they also promised that most investment will be in national stocks. Now, what we have is that the investment portfolio is heavily concentrated in government debt, as much as 82% in El Salvador, and also in bank deposits. Around 2/3 in two countries is in bank deposit, and this deposit pays very low interest. Actually, when you adjust the interest for inflation, usually is negative. And then you have foreign instruments, as much as 53% in Chile, and also a significant percentage in Peru. And nothing, or very little, is invested in national stocks as it was promised. And the final promise was that there will be very high capital returns. Again, the data shows that this is not the case. Gross real capital returns from the introduction of the private system until the year 1999 were the highest. After that, it have not been even much. And part of the problem was that there was more demand for those instruments than instruments in the market, because in most countries of Latin America, you don't have a well-developed capital market. And therefore, the prices of those few instruments exchanged in the capital market were overpriced. And after that, there was a decline during the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. There was some recovery in this long period of 10 years in the capital market, the highest boom in history, but they never recovered the initial period capital returns. And then with the 2020, 2021 crisis, there is another decline, for instance, 70% in Chile. And finally, the insured is the only one that bears the risk of this volatility, because you have to wait until, as I mentioned before, you have to wait until after the decline in the value of the pension fund during a crisis, it recovers the previous level. Otherwise, the pension will be smaller. On the other hand, as we have seen, profits from private administrators continue even during crisis. Well, Enrique, I don't know what to do, because this takes a long time, and I think I prefer, unless you have a better idea, to stop here and ask the people for questions, because otherwise it's going to take, let me make a calculation here. It's going to take at least 20 minutes more. So you tell me what you want me to do.
Profesor, si usted juzga que se puede detener aquí para tener un diálogo con...
Yes, I think, sí, yo creo que hay suficiente material para que la gente haga preguntas. Si no hacen preguntas, entonces yo continúo.
No, hay preguntas ya. Si usted lee la parte escrita donde ponen las preguntas, ya tiene preguntas. Entonces, pues puede continuar atendiéndolas.
Un momento, estoy buscando papel para escribir. A ver, ya estoy listo.
A ver, las tiene por escrito. Si usted abre el chat, abajo en la computadora donde dice More, ahí le abre y le va a salir chat. Le apoya en chat y le salen las preguntas. Si no, yo se las leo como usted.
I think it's, here, it's in the top instead of the, okay, instead of the bottom. Okay, one question. Actuaries always warned that promises were not realistic, but we have not been able to get ourselves.
Pero, a ver, váyase arriba porque tiene dos preguntas anteriores.
Ok.
La primera es de Vasco, ¿sí? ¿Ya la ubicó? Si sube el cursor.
¿Podrán ampliar el PowerPoint para que se vea solo la slide?
No. Esas son cosas que fueron al inicio. Baje el cursor un poco y va a encontrar.
Ok, pension reform in Latin America
donde
was
dice,
mostly.
Y dice, Vasco, me gustaría saber del sistema de aportaciones a las cuentas personales.
Perdón, pero yo estoy leyendo otra cosa aquí.
Sí, por eso.
Pension reform in Latin America was mostly intended to reduce subsidies from the state to contributory systems. No wonder coverage and replacement rate have decreased and that new non-contributory system have proliferated. Well, you are talking about one of the goals of privatization. It's very interesting that there were the ministries of finance, because before this process, the Minister of Labor and Social Security was in charge of the pension supervision, but the Minister of Finance was the one that promoted the reforms. Why? Because there were deficits that have to be paid by the state, and they were worried about, having deficits in the budget, and so they allied with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, in order to do the reforms, and a major reason was to reduce the deficit. There were other non-Social Security goals, such as they claimed that there will be an increase in employment and economic growth, etc. Goals that have been discussed in the literature a lot. So there were not really Social Security goals sponsored by the reformers.
Call from Silically.
So there were no really Social Security goals. They mostly were economic goals. They didn't have anything to do with the Social Security system. But the promises was that they will expand coverage. I mean, that I have documented that in my book in 2020. And so it's not my invention. It is what they promised. And that didn't happen at all. So let's see the next one.
Hay una anterior, profesor.
¿Cuál es la anterior?
Arriba, si quieres se la leo.
A ver, dígame. Despacito, despacio, por favor.
Dice, me gustaría saber del sistema de aportaciones a las cuentas personales a través del consumo en China. ¿Existe algún sistema? Y en segundo lugar, estos datos reflejan el desempeño del sector privado en América Latina para el caso europeo. ¿Cuál es el desempeño del sector privado para poder hacer una comparación? ¿O es inherente a la privatización de los sistemas de pensiones que bajen los resultados? Además, para algunos casos de América
larguísimo.
La solución del Estado ha sido la adquisición de deuda. ¿Cuál es la opinión respecto a eso?
Bueno, yo no agarré la tercera, pero la primera, no hay impuestos al consumo como se está haciendo en algunos países como en México. Eso no existe en China para financiar el sistema. La segunda, ¿qué es lo que decía la segunda? El desempeño del sistema privado. No hay una comparación entre en China, el sector más dinámico no es el sector estatal, es el sector privado. Por eso se llama socialismo de mercado. I'm sorry, I should answer this in English or in Spanish.
As you wish.
Okay. El sector privado es el más dinámico en la economía de China. Es la mayoría de ownership of the mix of production is private, is not public. And therefore, there is a very important role that the private system plays in China, and it has been in large measure the reason of very high economic growth rates and also increasing living standards. It's possible that in Latin America, we are talking about 20 countries, and if you add the Caribbean 35, the private sector is larger, but certainly it doesn't have anything to do with the size and performance of the private sector in China. What was the third question?
Del mismo autor es esa.
Okay.
Ahora, tiene una pregunta de parte de Enrique, así que le voy a dar la palabra a Enrique para que se la plantee.
Okay.
Enrique Dussel.
Sí, Carmelo, simplemente cuáles son, mira, tiene que ver probablemente con la posibilidad de que continúes presentando el caso de China, ¿no? Pero desde una perspectiva latinoamericana, Carmelo, el PIB per cápita de China está creciendo en forma muy sustantiva, muy por encima de América Latina. ¿Y eso qué implicaciones tiene para el financiamiento incluso en China, considerando la creciente confrontación que existe entre Estados Unidos y China, y en donde las empresas chinas se están viendo en la necesidad de salir de Estados Unidos, de salir de terceros países y de invertir en China, ¿no? No sé si has reflexionado sobre este tema.
Bueno, la parte política no tanto, pero tu punto principal es de que sí, el per cápita de China, tanto se utiliza simplemente conversión de dólares a la tasa de cambio oficial, o incluso si se usa la conversión, los llamados dólares internacionales de Purchasing Parity Power, es considerablemente más alta que la mayor parte de los países de América Latina. No sé, quizás Chile podría competir, que es el país que tiene el per cápita más alto de la región. Pero la mayor parte de los países van a estar por debajo. Por ejemplo, yo he hecho una comparación en este libro que estoy haciendo entre China, Cuba y Vietnam, y el per cápita de China muchísimo más alto que el de Cuba. Entonces, si tú tienes un incremento del income per cápita, tú vas a tener también un incremento de los salarios. Los salarios, todavía China tiene una competencia porque los salarios son relativamente bajos comparados con los salarios de los países industrializados de Europa y de Norteamérica. Pero los salarios en China han gradualmente aumentado, de manera que algunos economistas plantean de que eventualmente esa ventaja va a ir desapareciendo. Así que si los salarios aumentan y tú tienes particularmente en el sistema de empleados urbanos, que es financiado por contribuciones sobre el salario, que eso quiere decir que las contribuciones al sistema de seguridad social van subiendo. Eso es importante porque eso refuerza el sostenimiento financiero y actuarial del sistema en China. El problema que tiene China es que tiene un proceso de envejecimiento acelerado. Eso ha creado un problema. Se identifica como el obstáculo más serio para la sostenibilidad del sistema de pensiones. Y China ha empezado a tomar una serie de medidas, como por ejemplo, antes nada más que se podía tener un hijo, ahora puede tenerse hasta 3. Hay toda una serie de incentivos para las madres, etcétera, pero hasta ahora, es muy poco tiempo, pero hasta ahora eso no ha reducido el problema, no ha aumentado la tasa de fertilidad, etcétera.
Bien, hay un nuevo comentario de Vasco hasta abajo. Dice, hay nuevos sistemas sin impuestos, más bien con descuentos para aumentar el ahorro a través del consumo. ¿Es así, Vasco?
Sí.
Y esa pregunta la contesté. El impuesto del consumo Existen muy pocos de países de América Latina, creo que uno de ellos es México, pero eso no existe en China.
Muy bien, profesor, son todas las preguntas. Si usted quisiera tomarse unos 10, 15 minutos para redondear la parte de China que Enrique estaba señalando que se podía, con mucho gusto. Si no, terminamos aquí. Como usted
Bueno,
quiera.
voy a ver lo que puedo hacer. Ustedes me dicen cuando quieren que yo termine, ¿verdad?
Adelante.
Bueno, lo que yo hago aquí es que en cada uno de los principios de seguridad social que yo he analizado y las promesas que no se cumplen, ¿cuáles son las lecciones potenciales de América Latina para China? Empezamos con voy a start with the coverage of the labor force, the contributory, in putting together the two pension schemes, okay? The urban employees and the resident program. Coverage is about 42.5% of the labor force, so that's below the 50% of the ILO. I must tell you that at least I have reviewed half a dozen estimates, and this is extremely difficult, but this is my best calculation. It's expanding, it's growing. But there was a target that was 95% of the labor force. That certainly it will take a while to be met. Why Chile, Costa Rica, etc. But also there are 6 countries, the least developed, that have lower coverage. As I showed, there may be as low as 20%. Now, in the urban employee scheme, you have 68%, not 42 when you combine both. And only Uruguay, which is a pioneer in social welfare in Latin America, have a higher coverage. So it compares well in terms of the, well, only one country. The rest is lower than Uruguay. There are no estimates for the urban-rural resident scheme, so we cannot do that comparison. We have it together, and then we have the urban employee. But certainly it's much lower, the coverage in the urban employee program. And the reason is it's a voluntary program. They are non-salary workers, and migrant workers and what the Chinese call flexible employees, which is difficult to explain, but I will say it's pretty similar to the informal sector in Latin America. A lot of self-employed employees are in that category. They may join, but a very small percentage apparently is covered. So the resident scheme in China faces similar obstacles to the 6 less developed countries in Latin America, which is the informal sector. In most of Latin America, the self-employed don't have a mandatory coverage, but they have a voluntary coverage as in China. And then the coverage of the elderly population by contributory pensions, China doesn't have a specific non-contributory pension, which is one of the recommendations that I am doing in my book. But what they have is a social assistance pension available for the poor and other disadvantaged or vulnerable groups that covers 70% of the elderly population. That will be in the traditional literature, the zero pillar, before the basic social insurance pension. So the lessons that I suggest are gradually make mandatory the resident scheme, which is not easy. One thing is to put it in the law. Another thing is to implement that in practice. And very importantly, reduce the gap between the urban employee scheme and the urban-rural resident scheme. And for that, you need a higher state contribution to achieve those goals. By the way, in the program of the party for the year 2030, this is one of the goals. So I am not recommending something new. They already have that in mind, but the point is how long it will take for them to achieve that and how much it's going to cost. So let me go into the second, and I will go to, you tell me, social solidarity and gender equity. As in Latin America, this principle don't apply to the individual accounts, occupational plans, and the new commercial insurance. They only apply to the basic social insurance. But again, there is a significant gap between this and the resident scheme. One of the major problems I have found in China is fragmentation. Not only because of this dual system, but also because of the role of local governments. The local governments have standards. Local governments have different subsidies. So the armed forces have a separate scheme, and you have a lot of different treatments for migrants and the flexible employees according to the place where you are. It's a system which is very fragmented. The Chinese government have taken a series of measures of unification and standardization, but it's far to even make a dent in this fragmented system. And then gender equities, as in Latin America, are derived both from the labor market and individual accounts system. And the lessons that I have is that both principles have improved in Latin America by implementing state-financed benefits like in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Uruguay. So there are examples, practical examples of good practices in Latin America that can be adopted by China. China has much more resources than any of these countries in Latin America. And particularly, I would say, to establish a non-contributory pension system, either targeted on the poor or universal. I prefer the targeted approach because it's less expensive, and also it avoids the problem that a person that receives already a contributory pension, like in Bolivia, for instance, on top of that, receive a non-contributory pension. The only way to solve this problem suggested by Nicholas Barr is to impose a so-called affluent tax from the rich that deducts the amount received by the non-contributory pension. But with the accounting systems in Latin America and the fact that the majority of the tax revenue comes from the VAT instead of the progressive income tax, this would be very difficult to apply in the region. Continue? Okay. Now, benefit sufficiency. Well, replacement rate. I found a lot of estimates. I mean, it's very difficult to pick up one. But the replacement rate that I consider most plausible is 48.5% in the urban employee scheme, combining the basic insurance and individual account, which is slightly above the 45% ILO minimum. There is no replacement rate estimate for the urban rural resident scheme. Comparison with Latin America are not feasible. Even in Latin America, the only thing that we have is the Inter-American Development Bank comparison, and also the OECD, Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation. They calculate replacement rate, but they are hypothetical. It's under certain scenarios, which really doesn't help me too much. So even in Latin America, it is not easy. Even more difficult would be to compare it with China. But the average contributory monthly pension in the urban employee scheme meets essential needs. I have compared that with the basket of goods and services, as well as the per capita GDP income. But this pension in the urban employee scheme is 20 times the average pension of the urban rural resident scheme, which probably, I don't have the data, but probably doesn't meet essential needs. So it's another difference of this dual system. And then the lessons in several Latin American countries like Chile, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Uruguay have improved replacement rates, particularly of low pensions, by state contributions. And this is very important because it plays a progressive role in distribution. It goes not to everybody, but it's getting for those that have the lowest pensions. And that could be done in China. The fourth, which is administrative competition, efficiency, and low cost. I mentioned already, the pension system is very fragmented. Provincial and local governments play a key role deciding contribution, public subsidy, setting reference salaries, which generate divergence. And important positive steps that have been taken by the government are the gradual integration of previously separated pension schemes. For instance, civil servants have a separated scheme before. Now they are under the urban employee scheme, so that's positive. Unification in one agency of the collection of taxes and contributions, that is positive too. And some standardization in national norms. And finally, I think the most important is a so-called Central Adjustment Fund. This is from the central government, and the purpose of this is to try to reduce these huge differences in benefits. And this is something that I think should be expanded in China because the role will be very positive. I found that there is a low enforcement of employers' compliance, particularly with migrant employees. The employers have put a lot of pressure in the government, particularly during the pandemic, to reduce the employers' contribution, and the government did. The government, I have not really increasing that after the pandemic is not over in China, but I hope that previous contributions are reinstated. But there is a significant power of the big enterprises. And there are no data on administrative costs in basic social insurance and individual accounts. So we cannot do an evaluation of efficiency. The lessons that I suggest, in Latin America, competition does not exist or is poor in the administration of individual accounts, and costs are very high. That I prove. The state have strengthened the supervision and imposed restrictions on administrative commissions. China should publish information on this issue. I mean, it was impossible to find. I have a team of experts in China that is helping me, and they say, no way, we cannot find anything on this. This is very important data if you're going to evaluate the system in China. You can see, for instance, the basic social insurance balance. It has generated a surplus. That means that revenue is higher than expenditures, and that surplus as a percentage of GDP around the year 2020, it was 6.4. So that looks very good, but the problem is aging. That is not going to continue like that. Individual accounts as a percentage of GDP, only 2.5. And commercial insurance and individual accounts, 0.02. It's very small, as you see. Capital returns are very good. This is the percentage in 2020, 15.8. This is what we call nominal capital returns. You have to deduct inflation from that, but inflation is not so big. So this is a very healthy rate of return. But because of aging and the maturity of the pension system, the actuarial study done in the urban employee program shows that by the year 2035, the reserve will be exhausted. So they have to do a parametric reform of the basic public pillar in China. And the sooner, the better. As more you wait, more difficult are going to be the reforms. And the urban and rural residence scheme, no data, no actuarial study. So we don't know at all what is the situation of that program, but I don't think it would be better than the urban employee program. As I say, aging is a major problem in China, which has an older population than in Latin America, except for Cuba. Cuba has an older population than China. It's the oldest in Latin America. And China's policy to give incentive for more children, but what I have found is that most young couples have estimated that raising a child would cost like $90,000. And therefore, they are not taking the incentive so far. But it's too soon. We have to see what happens. And my lessons are that there is, as I mentioned, a 5-year plan began in 2022, so it's too soon. And they are recommending to raise the age 5 years for men and women. I must say that the years of retirement in China are very low because they are 60 for men and 55 for blue-collar women and 50 for white-collar women. Excuse me, the other way around. So they are very low in relation to the longevity at the time of retirement. Actually, some experts suggest that longevity is considerably longer, and therefore that is a problem. They have to rise back the contributions that were reduced during the pandemic, preferably to enterprises, and they have to do an actuarial studies. I think it's very important this is done by an external international organization, professional specialized in this type of work, and the ILO will be the best, certainly. They will do like alternative scenarios. So you change several parameters, you increase the age, you increase the contribution, you adjust the formula, and this simulation tells you if you do this, the program is going to be in equilibrium until the year X. And there is not an independent superintendence that provide regulation and oversight to protect the savings. I think this should be done. It's been done in most of Latin America. And particularly, it should be applied to the new commercial insurance to protect savings of insurance. So that basically is it. I had one final. Can I go? It's very short. Enrique, it's okay?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Now, I think there is a question for a very important debate on China pension policy. What I show for Latin American privatization of pensions, the individual accounts, is a negative performance. And I have published, I don't know how many books and articles on this, and the most recent 2 books in 2020 and 2022 by the last one by Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean is out, and by the way, it's free, digitally free. But this set a negative precedent about the individual accounts in China. So I asked myself, what should be the priority of Social Security pensions? 1, improve coverage and benefits in the resident scheme. I think this will be the most important priority. If I were a policymaker in China, I have been a consultant for 45 years, as well as to improve social solidarity and gender equity and social assistance for the majority of the labor force and the population, or developing individual accounts further for a minority of the labor force. There is no doubt for me what should be the priority, but this is a decision that China policymakers should do. Sorry it was so long, but it's a very complex issue. Enrique, it took a long time to do this summary. Actually, it helped me because it's helped me to develop the conclusions of the book, but it was not easy.
No, le agradecemos mucho su exposición muy interesante. Y bueno, si le parece, seguimos con un par de preguntas que
Seguro, claro, sí.
pintaron. Entonces, si quiere referirse al chat o
Para el chat.
como usted prefiera, pero
Déjeme ver, vamos a ver el chat. Existen lecciones, puedo empezar con esa,
con lo que usted quiera.
del caso de pensiones chinas para América Latina y el Caribe. Parecía ser que son pocas o es resultado de la todavía altísima población china en el sector rural. Es más eficiente, los usuarios obtienen resultados más altos pensiones. Es nada fácil realmente. Sí, es verdad, el problema del sector rural es importante. El sector rural, aunque se ha ido reduciendo en China, el grado de urbanización en China ha crecido enormemente, pero todavía y tiene el problema de la migración rural-urbana que también yo planteé. Pero bueno, en América Latina tiene el problema del sector informal. No quiero parecer un latinoamericano arrogante, pero yo no veo hasta ahora lecciones chinas para América Latina, porque son, primero, cuando usted habla de América Latina, ¿de qué estamos hablando? Porque nada tiene que ver El Salvador o la República Dominicana con Uruguay, Chile y Costa Rica. Las diferencias entre los países latinoamericanos en términos de las 5 principios fundamentales de la OIT son enormes. Entonces, ¿con cuál país usted lo quiere comparar? Yo traté de hacer alguna comparación en la cobertura, ¿verdad? Pero no es que esté comparando un país con otro país, está comparando un país con 20 países. Porque no ha hablado nada de los sistemas públicos. Son 10 países que tienen sistemas públicos. Todavía no se ha hecho ese estudio. Yo le he sugerido fuertemente a la CEPAL que haga ese estudio, y ese estudio no lo puedo hacer ni yo. Puedo hacerle los sistemas privados porque hay estadísticas. Los sistemas públicos no tienen estadísticas estandarizadas, así que hay que empezar por esa tarea. Tiene que ser un equipo de gente, un representante de cada uno de los 10 países que reúnan la información para poder hacer la evaluación. ¿Cuál sistema es más eficiente? Todavía más difícil, porque no hay información en China sobre, por ejemplo, costos administrativos, sobre competencia de las administradoras. En China es un sistema con agencias privadas, pero solo para el cuarto pilar, el pilar que se acaba de formar. Los otros no son privadas. A ver, ¿hay alguna otra cosa?
No, yo creo que
Ya.
cerramos con esto la sesión de esta mañana, agradeciéndole muchísimo su participación y esperamos que nos visite en el futuro muchas veces más.
Sí, déjeme decirle una cosa, que antes de tener vuestro Zoom, yo tuve un Zoom de media hora en el CIS de México, que está celebrando 80 años, la Comisión Interamericana de Seguridad Social. Ahí tuvo una presentación magistral también, y acabándose esa, he empezado esta. De manera que ha sido una mañana bien enredada. Pero sí, a ver ahí el futuro si buscamos otro tema en que pueda haber esa comparación.
Bueno, pues nuevamente le reitero nuestro agradecimiento y la invitación para que nos vuelva a visitar. Muchas gracias, profesor Mesa Lago.
Gracias, Enrique, por la invitación. Encantado.
Muy buen día.
Gracias por tu esfuerzo. Gracias.
Y
Bye,
bueno, a nuestro auditorio les recuerdo que está abierta la convocatoria para participar en el 6º Seminario Internacional América Latina y el Caribe y China, Condiciones y Retos en el Siglo XXI, que organiza la Red América Latina, el Caribe y China. Este seminario se llevará a cabo vía Zoom, lo cual es una ventaja, del 29 al 31 de mayo de 2023. Y la fecha final de envío de propuestas es el 23 de enero. O sea que tenemos tiempo, por favor, piénsenlo para que participen. Toda la información del evento, la convocatoria, etcétera, está en la página del Sechimex, desde luego. Les agradecemos que hayan estado con nosotros esta mañana y les deseamos muy buen día. Gracias y hasta luego.